Wonderful, wonderful. So nice to be here with you, Scott. The Valerie was asking what an earthen hand was today. Earthen hand. Well, what a good name.
What is an earth in hand? Well, I named my company after the earth itself. And my inspiration for that was to really to be the hand of the earth, because we are the earth. I was just saying this a moment ago. And so we are the hands of the earth. We can express what the earth wants to create through us.
She also said, "Oh, does that mean the earth is in hand as well?"
Yeah. It's often confused with earth in hand, yes, and it's the same. And earth in hand meaning that we're always working with the Adobe material, and we always have a little bit of clay and sand on our hand.
And if your hands were made of earth, it would be high dielectric.
That's right. Yeah, you got to get some of that high dielectric crystalline sands, just rub it
Right,
all over yourself.
right. The
And,
perfect ceramic, indeed, indeed.
well,
Well,
hello
well,
to
great.
Valerie as well.
Yeah, she's here, and we were talking about you today. We had such a great time when you're here, and your lady was very impressive. She's very disciplined and organized, and
Oh, she's wonderful. Yeah,
yeah.
she's actually in Taiwan right now. She's helping her mom who
Oh,
had
I
to get
see.
brain surgery. So
Right. It actually we prepared our rice pasta in the way we learned from her for months afterwards. So yeah, so today's conversation, I thought we'd give it a shot at trying to be quite organized, at least initially, in a preliminary outline kind of way about what actually biologic architecture means in very specific, even electrical terms. That was the idea. And I think where that story sort of starts is, as we've often said, you already inhabit an array that is your synapses, which is a net of fireflies. I mean, a nest of spark gaps. And what it is that inhabits the nest of spark gaps is very essentially something which is measurably centripetal. So if ever there was an electrical definition of consciousness, among other things, it would be the ability to be electrically centripetal. Bill Tiller's famous measurements that focused attention causes charge to compress. So whatever inhabits, by definition, has to be electrically centripetal, or the array is not going to be glued together. And as we often talk about the kids who see without their eyes when they're blindfolded, the first thing they see blindfolded after they go into this bliss state, where the harmonics of the brain waves enable their brain harmonics to also get centripetal and do a squeezing. And so the kids always say, well, then a little tube vortex tornado, a little tube, literally a vortex, shows up inside their head, and they play around with the angle and the focus until they squeeze that tube. And as the tube is squeezed, and the inner muscles to do that is the magic, it's literally a bliss state. They imagine themselves in beautiful nature. Their brain waves flip a switch and they get fractal and start imploding. And then that state of a quasi-trance state enables them to squeeze that vortex inside their head, vortex looking like this. And then the center of that charged plasma vortex becomes an eyeball. And that is the point, that vortex did not become aware or conscious until there was the possibility of imploding or getting centripetal. And the term inhabit here, from the Hebrew inhabit, the H as in Yod He Vav He, Hebrew for five, means amorphous and space filling the breath. So inhabit literally means charge is breathed into the space, and the breath specifically has to be centripetal. So literally, from an electrical engineering viewpoint, what makes your skull inhabitable is that a charged vortex is enabled permissively to get centripetal there. Now, if you happen to have had French fries for lunch, it'll mess up the dielectric constant of that cavity, and therefore your brain will get foggy and you won't focus as well, especially if it's made of the wrong oil. So the capacitance of that cavity determines whether you're able to implode it and determines the sharpness of your focus. And as in, we'd have this Therify.net famous plasma system, and 30% of the people come out saying my vision sharpened somewhat because they got more centripetal. And by the way, usually if you, after you take a pee, you see a little sharper too. And the reason is the urine flushed out, restoring your dielectric constant. So there's many things that sharpen your vision, and also going into biologic architecture will, if it's done right, literally electrically cause your vision to get sharper, because the little vortex that you call perception inside your head got squeezed, and so the sharpness of the point. So it is that ability in a space to implode charge that is the definition of all life force. So that's where we start with defining biologic architecture. How do you make a capacitor a charge envelope within which that implosion is enabled? Obviously, the geometry of the harmonics determines if it can implode, and the electrical quality of the material determines if it can implode. We call that quality of material, we call it dielectric constant. Most of you are familiar with our original chart and curriculum from biologic architecture. I'm going to try sharing a little screen here, one moment. This is from the original. So this is Michael Rice. Here is an egg shape, and the wood has a high dielectric constant. And when we sat in there, everyone just would smile. Everyone was just happy because it was so blissful to be there. And this egg shape was reflected in the building that contained the egg. And Michael Rice often uses the egg shape. These are very old slides, but you get the idea that the reason you use geometry is to make the charge implode. In other words, bragging that you use the right ratios is not the final determinant of whether you succeeded. What actually measurably determines if you succeeded would be if you created a space in the room where implosion was enabled. This is actually the definition of temple, of sacred space. For example, you all know that in the Sufi film, Meetings with Remarkable Men, the greatest saint was the one who knew how to make an echo. So they were literally between the mountains, and they had this contest, who can make the echo? This is Gurdjieff's Meetings with Remarkable Men. Well, it turns out that making an echo here is more than metaphor for the skill to be a biologic architect, because the place where the sound wave, longitudinal, bounces recursively to center is more than metaphor for where the capacitive voltage charge wave also converges and implodes to center. So that is specifically what Carlos Castaneda meant when he said, every time you go into any room, you feel your way around and find your place of power. What did he mean? The place of power is the place where the charge waves implode, which is often parallel to where the phonon sound waves implode. And that's the sweet spot, the implosion spot, the heart of the matter, et cetera, et cetera. So if you got the ratios right, then that implosion would actually create a set of capacitive harmonics, which would be measurable. And there's all kinds of ancient metaphors for this. And, there was an argument about whether these ancient forts were really designed to create sacred space. They said, well, no, this was mostly a military consideration, but actually the military considerations have a lot to do with the design of capacitors, of why they were pent. But one of the main points we wanted to make here was the very concept of stupa or sacred space is inherently, directly connected to the idea of what makes a capacitor implode, which is to say, recursively cause the voltage charge wave to converge towards center recursively, implosively. So, for example, the ancient stupas, they didn't have the problem. Now they put these things under electric power transformers, and they're disgusting. And now they put metal rebar in the concrete, and they're disgusting because they forgot what sacred is. Oops. And the only one that can really tell them what sacred is someone who understands that electrically. And is the gold here is a wonderful service to that. So, but the main reason I broke out the slideshow is this very old slide, which I hope you've all seen. But so here is where we talk about what does dielectric constant mean? Dielectric constant refers to the material between the plates of a capacitor. There's two metal plates, and you got sandwiched in the between there a quote unquote insulator whose dielectric constant determines the efficiency of that capacitor, which simply means the voltage between the two plates starts those two plates ringing like a bell. And if the material sandwiched between the two plates of a capacitor has a high dielectric, that means that the bell is ringing efficiently. In fact, you could even meditate on this. This is a quasi-spiritual idea from an electrical engineer, that there are certain dielectric materials, barium, strontium, titanate, phase conjugate mirrors, which, if the dielectric constant of that material between the plates of capacitor is high enough, then that capacitor is by definition a 0-point energy, vacuum energy source device. In other words, you have accessed 0-point energy by definition if the dielectric constant of the material you stuck in there is high enough, because it's literally implosive. That means charge distribution efficiency. So to think rigorously about this, charge distribution efficiency defines life and defines architecture success for the reason that that term is used by electrical engineers, because charge definition distribution efficiency is another name for God. Hello. In other words, sacred space, ancestral memory, et cetera. So back to this chart. So what we say is that Steiner essentially was right when he said the children should never touch synthetics, polyester, plastic, and aluminum. The children should, or steel or aluminum, that the children should only touch, in the Steiner school, material that was once alive. Wood, natural fabric, and of course, limestone and calc. These are all biologic materials which have inherently a higher dielectric constant. And what that means is that the molecules in material that were once part of life danced around, and they saw my bumper sticker, which says get fractal or get dead. And so the molecules rearranged themselves into a fractal, and that was called living material, which means charge distribution efficiency, which means when your child sits in that building made of living building material, their aura can breathe. This is the storal to the mori here. This is the bottom point. So I'm going to turn off the slides in a minute, but just so you get the idea that among fabrics, high dielectric versus low, among stone, among wood, for example, close-grained hardwood are a higher dielectric than coarse-grained softwood. And it makes sense because obviously the capacitance is better distributed in certain hardwoods. It has to do with trace mineral. There's many factors, but the general concept is very simple. Now I'm going to turn off this picture here, stop the share. So here's the goal. Your kid wanders into a building. Can their aura breathe or not? Which is to say, when they go to bed at night, is there a place for their lucid dream to go? Remember, we did quite a bit of work on this. We studied the physics of lucid dreaming and the physics of soul. And it has directly to do with biologic architecture because, so we won't dig up the slides here, but they're at therify.net and flameandmind.com. But the slides show that in the university studies on which frequencies cause lucid dreaming, it's 29 and 49 hertz, I think, that those frequencies that in the university study actually helped trigger lucid dreams, we later realized these are the frequencies that are phase conjugate to Planck, which is golden ratio multiple Planck, which is to say are implosive. So when you get compression working, Theraphi.net plasma, triggered by exactly that caduceus of low frequencies, is famous for triggering lucid dreaming. And remember, those who lucid dream measurably are going to be the ones who take something with them at death. Is that important? Yes. And so the ability to experience compression, that squeezing process, for example, where magnetic lines cross, the perfect place to put a temple, that squeezing process squeezed out the center of that vortex, and the transverse wave at the squeezing point where pine cones kiss, the transverse wave are sorted into the longitudinal waves, sometimes called scalar, which is what gravity is made of, which is what the collective unconscious is made of. And that coherent longitudinal interferometry is sometimes called the Kesjan body, rainbow light body, or the Ba from the Ka. These are terms that were used in the spiritual literature that electrical engineers today need to understand in order to understand what a soul is. So when you make that body of coherence around your aura, you assemble something. Gurdjieff called it, have you made your Kesjan body? You ain't going to get immortal unless. Well, if you're living in a steel and aluminum building full of electrosmog and crap, that ain't gonna grow too good. So the physics of soul is literally to accrete that coherence around your aura. Okay, so I'm carrying on and talking very fast here, which I enjoyed, but I'm happy to do some questions in between, shall we? Or
Well, thank you, Dan. It's just such a pleasure having you here. And yeah, I mean, I have a lot of questions, and I think I'd like to start with a couple of my own and then open it up for students here. But, mostly what I'm interested in right now is I talked with Lydia and Arturo about the differences between designing a temple versus designing a home. And essentially, what I'm gathering is that, there may be certain forms and certain forces in the earth, say of different locations, different magnetic lines that are wonderful for a temple, but they're terrible for your home. So how can we decide, which types of geometry are appropriate for a home and which ones aren't?
that's a lovely and a very useful question. Actually, I remember as we were playing around with the sacred mountain in Byron Bay, Mount Wollumbin, Mount Warning in Australia, and the natives were so absolutely clear that the sacred space is never the living space. If you ask any tribal person about that, the sacred space and the living space, are they? No. The sacred space and the living space are never the same space. Why? Well, another thing we learned about sacred space was if friends of ours in Western New York, they studied all the ancient tumulus, the stone monuments of the area, and they came to the conclusion that none of these sacred stone circle structures ever was used to live in. Nope. They used them to charge the seeds, so the seeds would germinate. That was a function. They also used them for birth and death. Whenever you need the Stargate and the portal to work, oh yeah. But did you use them to live in? Never. So essentially, I think we could even take a clue to this from what is another known aphorism of biologic architecture, is that where the water veins cross is a great place to charge your seeds and to send prayers, but it's a horrible place to sleep. Do you know why? You should design your house so carefully. In fact, our biologic architecture here, they actually do it. If there's a water vein under the house, they design the house so the water vein is under a wall, so nobody is going to sit there. Why do they do that? Well, it's actually ultra simple. It's because if you try laying down and sleeping over a water vein, where is your aura going to go? It's going to want to go with the water, for the same reason that if you drive kids by a rushing river, suddenly every one of them needs to pee. It's the same physics. it's that the water wants to return to the flow. It's very simple. So if you got a really living river, that any water nearby is going to want to jump in for you, whether you wanted to pee or not. You're going to need to pee. The idea here is that sacred space is a space where the charge compression is such that you can do certain important tasks, like trigger seed germination. You can use it to launch lucid dreaming beautifully, and probably it will be a horrible place to sleep. In fact, probably you can't sleep there, or at least it's like sleeping by a rushing river. So this is one idea underlining the sense of the difference between a biologic house and a biologic temple. The temple has a rate of implosion which would be very good, for example, for healing, for birth and death, for stargates and portals, for launching a lucid dream, remote viewing, all kinds of cool, fun stuff. But in terms of a place for sleeping or living, remember, even quote unquote sacred plasma systems like Therify.net, there is such a thing as too much. And if you get too much, one of the symptoms is actually dehydration, which would be one symptom actually of trying to live in a temple, because your body is imploding all that time. So another thought about this, I remember, I guess the story I've told too many times, but I was there with Gus Ciccacci in his temple home in Massachusetts, in New England. We had just gotten back. Well, he introduced me to Bucky Fuller, actually, and he built his house like one rung on the ladder of DNA: hex, pent, and a golden ratio rectangle, and a hex and a pent. So the top-down view of his house is one codon of DNA. That's the top-down view of his house. Now, in the hex part of the house, you were allowed to have secrets. In the pent part of the house, you were only allowed to have distribution, and secrets were not possible. It's actually good physics. You see what I'm saying? So there's certain parts of the temple, square root of 2 geometrics cubic incubating was possible there. And in the other parts where pent was possible, there you could repent and be saved. I mean, you could make your memories shareable. And literally, repenting is literally allowing the embeddability that restores to distribution. So yes, you could have quite a conversation about, the difference between a house, a home, and a sacred temple. But the short answer is, in the home, you design certain areas whose capacitance is designed for distribution and openness, and others for privacy and secrets. And that is based on geometry, and it is related to hex versus pent beautifully. But in general, the level of implosion that creates what we call sacred space or temple, where, for example, repeatedly it has been proven telepathy is enabled. Magnetic line cross points of the earth, telepathy is enabled, which is a great place to do telepathy, but probably a horrible place to sleep.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Michael Rice told me a story about some folks that tried to design and live in a septagon-shaped house, 7-sided house, and apparently it did not go well.
Well, 7-sided is a shadow of a tetracube, so it would be not unlike living in a cube, theoretically, which would not be good, probably, actually. Okay. Incubating, because the square root of 2 harmonics create max destructive interference, which is perfect for isolating charge and terrible for distributing charge. So whenever nature wants to isolate charge, she uses square root of 2 incubation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and you talk a lot about designing our buildings so that we're not isolating ourselves from, the Schumann resonance and the other vibrations that are surrounding us from the cosmos, right? So if you surrounded yourself with a
cube,
a Faraday cage, perhaps like a network of steel studs, or even steel or aluminum roofing materials, these are all pretty terrible for our bioenergy field, correct?
That's right. It's very hard to lucid dream through an aluminum roof. And the idea is that I did this new film, Lena Denon is releasing today on the deep science of love. And the short answer was love is perfect embedding, literally, which is the opposite of charge isolation. Which means, you don't build a Faraday cage if you want to feel the Schumann harmonics. You build the opposite. You build a sacred tree.
Bless you. Well, yeah, so it's been, I don't know, about a year now. I got your Flame in Mind software, and I got the Muse 2 carbon fiber headband antenna, and I've been measuring capacitance in different spaces, both indoors and outdoors, and just sort of taking notes. And um, honestly, I'm still just a beginner at reading the measurements that I've taken. But I gathered from your book, Planck Fire, and your websites about the Flame in Mind software, that it seems that the 53 hertz or 50 hertz in that realm shows up repeatedly in every sacred space. So can you walk us through some of the numbers of the vibrations? Because like the Schumann resonance is about 7.8 hertz, and then if you work with those, you talk about Planck, the musical key signature of the universe, times integer exponents of the golden ratio phi, right? So this is a series of numbers that shows up in everywhere in the universe, all the patterns, all the geometry. And so sacred space has these certain vibrations in it that we can start to read from the measurements, right? So we're looking for 7.8, we're looking for 53. What are the other numbers in the series?
Yes, very useful conversation. Actually, I think for that conversation, it would be good to look at the visuals on that.
Oh yeah, let's do
And
that.
for that, the main website about that is flameinmind.com/lifeforce. And so if I went to flameinmind.com/lifeforce and then showed you some of those measures, as we bring that up, I'd like to remind people that here are some of those measurements. You're seeing my screen, yes. So this, first of all, like in the measurement of this tree here, this is a super, super happy sacred tree. And we put the brainwave measure on the tree and we spectrum analyze. And sure enough, here we have the 7.8 hertz. And here we have the 14 and the 30. I'm 33. We got a map of the Schumann harmonics. It was gorgeous. This was a super happy tree, but you're not going to get this out of every tree. This was a tree that was not near a noisy road. This was a tree when it's not windy. And this is a tree that was super healthy and happy. Actually, it would happen to be in the center of a stone circle. So the way we label this in the spectrum analyzer, flameinmind.com/lifeforce, you see that the known Schumann harmonics here are in blue, and the measured harmonics here are in yellow. And I'm going to pick a different slide that shows 50-53 a little better. But first, let me explain the theory a little more. So the known Schumann harmonics here are in green, and this is a little small. Let me see if I can make it bigger. Yeah, it's a little bigger. So here is 7.83, 14.3, 20.8, and the next one here would be about 30. So in green, you have the actual theoretical Schumann harmonics, which are displayed down here. Oh, I'll get that chart out in a minute. So in green, the known Schumann harmonics. In blue, you see would be actually exact golden ratio times Planck. And so that is the theory of PlanckFire.com, that if you take the actual, start with Planck and do simple exponents, accurate integer exponents golden ratio, get 2.78, 7.29, and 11.8 and 19.09. And this becomes very significant because later, when we see that the theoretical Schumann should have been 50 hertz, but the measured Schumann was 53 all over the world. And that is exactly the ratio between 7.29 theoretical perfect and 7.83 the actual Schumann harmonic. So the Earth natural resonance was set up probably by Hermes, where the Schumann harmonics is almost a perfect phase conjugate pump wave implosive, which is why Gaia is negentropic and self-aware, and why the brainwave harmonics right here are actually in that cascade. Let me see if I reload this, I get more of the pictures. So I wanted to show you some of the measurements we made that Scott nicely referred to here. Notice that the Earth is pulsing every 26 seconds, which is actually the Mayer wave, 0.1 hertz. So the most important frequency of the blood and the sacrocranial, the most important HRV frequency in the world, 0.1 hertz, a 10-second wave, happens to be a natural resonance of the Earth. Hello. So this is what Scott was referring to right here. So here, this is bamboo architecture. This is actually in Bali. And here's cows in a field. And here's a biologic dome. And here's the Visico pyramid in Bosnia. And what do they all have in common? Here's that 53 hertz peak. Okay, and here is the Schumann harmonic down here. There's a little peak there. And you see, if you actually look at the documented, agreed in physics Schumann harmonic, 7.8314. So that ratio between 7.29 and 7.83 actually produces the difference between 50 and 53 hertz. It's interesting because when you measure in the top of the Bosnian pyramid, the 20,000 hertz, it actually fits that cascade perfectly as well. It's actually 28 kilohertz. That's the actual, the theoretical, if you can't carry the cascade from theory on, it becomes 26,000 hertz. The measured in Bosnia and elsewhere is almost 28,000 hertz. And it's because of that difference between what the actual Schumann cascade is and what the Earth grid. But, this is the original chart of golden ratio harmonics and Planck. You've probably all seen that from PlanckFire.com, predicts hydrogen geometry, and this is a dominant geometry of all orbital mechanics in general is golden ratio times Planck. The reason that golden ratio times Planck dominates all orbital mechanics in general is because that's the only way you can make stable gravity and therefore atmosphere. So, but back to Scott's very useful question. This is very hard to measure in most houses. If it's windy, it ain't going to happen. Most times when you actually can measure a house doing something magic like this, generally it probably is necessary to go downstairs and turn off the main circuit breaker because the electrosmog will overwhelm these harmonics. And when we were measuring using the same tools to measure fresh fruit, you could measure whether food is fresh, or you could measure whether an egg is alive or dead this way. There's pictures, but you could only do it in super quiet environments. So in most buildings, the Schumann resonance is so far from available that But if you're in a very quiet nature space and there's not much wind, things are really quiet, there's no electrosmog, you get lucky, then you can measure the Schumann cascade. And by the way, if you can measure it, that will generally predict in advance what tree is going to live, what house is going to be sacred. So it's a very useful skill to work on this. Anyway, go ahead, Scott.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Dan. Well, I'm curious what questions you guys might have. Does anybody have a question they'd like to ask at this time?
Is everyone imploding? I mean, blissful.
Okay. Yeah. If you don't have any yet, it's okay. So you talk a lot about non-destructive charge collapse.
Exactly. That is the point.
I think it's hard for the beginner to grasp how pervasive this phenomena is, and just how it's so crucial to understand, why gravity works, how life works, why we're alive,
exactly,
how consciousness works. So it's amazing and so incredibly exciting to find one equation that explains all these seemingly disparate things in the universe. And I don't know, maybe you want to talk for just a couple of minutes about your process in arriving at that discovery.
Well, thank you for asking the perfect public relations question. No, but you're right. You see, when charge starts to implode towards center, remember, the universe is made of a single contiguous compressible medium, which is a superfluid, sometimes called the ether. And the stuff of that superfluid is named charge. And plus and minus charge is the compression rarefaction of that superfluid. And that is the ether. That is the stuff of which the unified field is made. And there is nothing else. And anybody that tries to say, oh, gravity is separate from electromagnetism, or consciousness is separate from electric fields, anybody tries to convince you of any of those separatenesses, just tell them they're schizophrenic and you don't want that disease. No, it's a unified field and that's the only thing that works. So once you understand that everything is made of that compressible superfluid called charge, then you can begin to think about why conventional physicists virtually have all agreed that charge collapse causes gravity. That's not new information. What causes charge collapse is the new information. That's the question I answered with Planck times golden ratio. And also, in addition, a very large number of psychologists and neuroscientists also agree that charge collapse causes consciousness. And they're right. And the new information is what is the cause of charge collapse. And that's called PlanckFire.com, PlanckPhire.com, which you take Planck, the musical key signature of every wave in physics, and you simply multiply by golden ratio harmonics, exactly, which is called fractality perfected. And by the way, almost all physicists already agree that fractality is cause of gravity, because they already know that fractality is the definition of infinite non-destructive compression, which is Einstein's name for the solution of the unified field, infinite non-destructive compression. So it's not even new information that fractality causes gravity, and it's not new information that charge collapse causes gravity. The only new information here is what's the cause of fractal charge collapse, and that is start with Planck, multiply by golden ratio, and you get all this beautiful, every living biologic frequency, Earth year, Venus year, galactic year, precessional year, the dominant geometry of all orbital mechanics, the dominant geometry of all biologic mechanics, the dominant frequency of everything negentropic in the universe. So how does that work? So when the charge is inhabiting, for example, a hydrogen atom, I wrote the equation to prove this is specifically the hydrogen atom and the reason that hydrogen has and makes gravity, multiples of golden ratio. So this enables charge collapse. What it means is that the waves can add and multiply recursively constructively because of golden ratio, moving towards center, and that implosion of charge towards center starts an inertia, a wind of charge moving towards center. And the inertia of that wind of charge moving towards center, that geometry of compression initiates acceleration of charge towards center. The only definition of gravity is that acceleration of charge. And that's why that charge collapse causes gravity, because as the charge accelerates, the experience of that acceleration of charge towards center is named the gravity. So once you know what causes a charge collapse, then for the first time, you know why objects fall to the ground. Unfortunately, Einstein, Stephen Hawking's NASA, no, they didn't figure it out. Second thing is that inertia of that charge moving towards center creates a self-sorting phenomena at the center of that tornado vortex where the pine cone's kissing noses. Because as a charge moves toward that compression at center, the only wave that can move through that center and come out the other side has been sorted. As we say, just like after a good fight in an Irish pub. So when the compression is exchanged after the fight, after the compression, the sorting phenomena means the only wave that gets through is the one that agrees. In other words, the shareable wave has been tested. Pure intention has been tested. And that's called negentropy. It's the origin of all, and the proof of that actually is in phase conjugate optics, super dielectric, and the lasers meet in opposite directions, and they call it time reversal and self-organization, and it's been measured. But it happens that all negentropy happens in that way as well, between the pine cones kissing noses, because the implosion of charge towards center sucks all waves to that center, and only the ones which are sorted can emerge. And that's the origin of negentropy. And in physics, that was measured. They called it time reversal, but actually it was self-organization, because they could not time reverse toward disorder by measurement. No, 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 no. You can't time reverse clean steel to rusted steel. You can time reverse rusted steel back to clean steel, but not the reverse. In other words, you can only move toward order when you're doing time reversal by measurement. What does that tell you? That tells you that negentropy and time reversal are basically the same thing. Anywho, so this charge collapse, solving the problem of charge collapse, solves the problem of consciousness also, because you know why all these neuroscientists have always said, well, perception, focus, attention collapse the wave function. What did they mean? You know, if you got some waves and they're moving around and you want to take a picture, you have to collapse the wave function and imagine there was a still point, because, you know, taking the photograph, literally a digital sample, is a process of creating a still point. And if there was no still point, there was no picture, there was no perception. So the still point, they say, the perception collapses the wave function. Well, it actually means more than that, as when Bill Tiller showed that by hundreds of measurements, focused human attention causes charge to compress. And if you got a really strong Draco doing a mind meld with you, it will feel like a vice. So the amount of compression in the electric field you call your attention is an electric measurement of how powerful your attention is. That's why charge collapse is so important. And just one final comment. When after Ray Moody measured with many surgeons that death visions are contagious, the reason successful death is defined by charge collapse is important here, because what's happening is that, remember, these kids who saw without their eyes, with their eyes closed, they went into a trance. Almost all of them, after they get the vortex working, they can see, a lot of them, they begin to see their ancestors, which tends to freak out the Western parents, but the Eastern parents have no problem with that. So the physics of the clairvoyance is that coherent longitudinal interferometry, seeing their ancestors in that array, sometimes called ancestral memory, collective unconscious, communion of saints. You get the flavor. So to get into that array of compressed and organized longitudinal EMF, sometimes called scalar, that array, the collective unconscious, dreaming track songline, you don't get into that array unless you can do squeezing very good. And that's why death requires charge collapse. It is literally a mini black hole experience. You see the famous Heinrich Clouvet form constants, lattice, cobweb, tunnel, spiral, and that's your DNA braid imploding to get you squeezing well enough to inhabit the array. And that's why if the death was not organized, the ghost gets stuck, because you need to implode and squeeze very well in order that you can get to the charge. It's literally voltage density of the nodes in that array, the only place where telepathy is measurable, for example, and that's the dream track songline. And so to get into that array requires the squeezing of a successful death. And why, for example, Therify.net and other devices like that are famous for releasing stuck ghosts, because stuck ghost is a plasma field that failed to complete the implosion that enabled charge distribution. So charge collapse is a very good introduction to compression is the solution to almost every single problem physics has ever named. So successful compression or charge collapse is the definition and success of history of urban design, the definition of the success of alchemy, the definition of successful death, the definition of biologic architecture, the definition of fusion research, the successful death, successful compression, successful compression is the answer to every single problem you could actually think about if you're thinking only about pure principle. So I do recommend studying charge collapse, which is plantfire.com. Thank you for asking my favorite question there, Scott.
Pleasure. Bradley.
Thank you so much, Mr. Green. This is really wonderful to meet you. You remind me of a friend of mine, Aya Shivaya, who has a sacred geometry course. But my question was like, objectively, how do we measure the hertz, and what design elements are tried and true already to apply integrated in our unique creative designs? Like, for example, I'm really interested in how we as humans could, on the horizontal plane, regenerate the biodiverse habitats. And then on the vertical plane, how we can grow our own food aeroponically and also harvest solar and wind. So like each floor on my design has a nursery for that biodiverse habitat. And each floor has instead of the wind turbine on this plane, it's on the horizontal plane with that centrifugal weighted force, so that effortlessly wind in any direction can spin that for a turbine. So like, how can we measure objectively that hertz, and when we say like there's a concern of a temple overstimulating, but is it more like we're just not used to using more of our brains, when so it seems subjectively like we're overstimulating, but we're just really using more of our brain? So
Nice. And that shows that you've really been thinking about these things. I appreciate that. But to answer specifically the first part of your question, so the tool that we're using to measure life force, flameinmind.com, remember, it is made of a brainwave spectrum analyzer. That's how we started. And that's how we measure life force in buildings very successfully. In fact, you know that Juan Schlosser in Bali, bioarchitects.net, and they have a multi-million-dollar contract in India to build Sacred Temple based exactly on these principles. And he's the one who pioneered the use of our flameinmind.com to measure life force in buildings. He had bamboo structures. He measured what's called harmonic inclusiveness, the spectrum analysis of the Schumann cascade in the bamboo buildings. And then we measured the correlation of that harmonic inclusiveness. Remember, harmonic inclusiveness defines how long anything is going to live. You, an electron, a tree, or a galaxy. Its lifetime is defined by harmonic inclusiveness. Any doctor knows that harmonic inclusiveness in heart rate variability is the best measure of your immune health. So harmonic inclusiveness perfected is the definition of golden ratio times Planck. So, which is to say non-destructive compression. So the ability to design a living space, the reason, for example, Therify.net is so famous for triggering seed germination, as were pyramids, is because centripetal force is basically the beginning of a seed's ability to germinate, because it has to really suck. And that really sucks. No, I mean, the ability to implode is how it's going to suck in its first nutrient. So it's obvious why pyramids originally were used to germinate seeds, because it made them implosive. So this is a big clue to what your building needs to do. It needs to get centripetal, and we measure very accurately the specific harmonics of that using the Flame in Mind brainwave software. There's lots of ways to do it, but that's very powerful. It can be reasonably inexpensive. You need to spectrum analyze a microvolt relatively accurately to do that, and a brainwave spectrum analyzer works great. And then you can see which building is alive and which is dead, and even which egg is alive and which is dead, using the same transducer, actually. And those harmonic measures, those frequencies, that's not subjective. It's very accurate power spectrum. And yes, then, then the layering of that building could be, by design, a more implosive capacitor, and actually even the echo of the wind in those cavities.
Yeah, because I was also thinking about how if there was some tool, like even if in a U joint, that you could like spectrum analyze, like, is that going to replicate in the whole structure, since everything is in a fractal infinitely. So yeah, so it's just like wondering if there's anything like that to
and it's really true. Measuring the possibility of an echo is actually much related, because the phonon resonance is going to be in phase with the capacitance if you did it right.
Right.
Which is why the Sufi is looking for the perfect echo, because they're right on their way to measuring the capacitor implode. And if you want the place of power in a room, you literally can go in and kind of echolocate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
We've also been talking about dowsing a fair amount. You know, it seems like you could build the perfectly designed structure and put it in the wrong place and not get the right results. So I think we should address that just a little bit in terms of you talk a lot about the nodes of compression. So within the three-dimensional space where we exist, there are nodes where there's a central crossing of energy, and then we also have the ley lines, the magnetic ley lines on the Earth. And so if we take all those and we realize there are dozens, literally dozens of invisible forces in the Earth also to consider when we consider where to put our building, right? Radioactivity, infrared, gases coming out of the Earth, gravity anomalies, and so on. So, what can you offer us in terms of how to practically douse and how to integrate that into the overall process of the design?
Again, that's a perfect question. First of all, remember, since the magnetic lines of the Earth is the magnetic blood of the Earth, and where magnetic lines cross is where ancestor memory and telepathy works, and all temples and sacred space and labyrinths start where magnetic line crosses. So clearly that is life or death to be able to feel that magnetic line. And yes, okay, it's okay to go out and hire a dowser to help you locate where to put your house. However, I would caution you that if in general you cannot feel a magnetic line, unfortunately, that means you cannot feel. Oops. Another way of saying that is the more you have access to bliss, peak experience, peak percent, whatever, ecstasy, trance, there's a lot of names, but the implosion that precedes charge radiance, named bliss, the more you have access to that charge density, the more your blood becomes an antenna for the magnetic lines of the Earth. So at first I noticed I could kind of feel them. And then when I don't need rods, I just hold my hands out. But then I noticed later that I can walk up to a field of, some acres, a large field, and I use my inner radar and I can point to where the magnetic line crosses in that field and walk to it. And almost every time the magnetic lines talk to me. It's amazing. But this is after some years. But the magnetic lines of the Earth literally are the blood of the Earth, and they are your blood. And to embed in that connection is life or death. So what I'm saying is, please just play around, start to learn that you can actually feel them for yourself. If you want to play with dowsing rods, fine. The best thing to do is find your favorite spot in beautiful nature where you already suspect there's some energy there, and then you really kind of relax and you walk slowly across what you suspect is the magnetic line and wait for your hands to tingle a little bit. Anybody can do it. It's so simple. And if you start training yourself, suddenly you will be in a conversation with the magnetic blood of Earth. And that's fun, man. It's just like, remember, the dowsing 101, when they missed the water vein, when they drilled the well, the dowser shows up and uses a hammer and some rods and percussion and moves the water vein. Okay. But you know what the advanced dowser does? He'll never use a hammer and rods. Hell no. He goes down there and he talks to that water vein and they have a conversation. Oh, yeah, it's real. This is not subjective. Ball lightning is highly famous for responding to telepathy for the same reason, living plasma. So, yes, the conversation with the magnetic lines of Earth is essential to your structure. Absolutely. There are many wonderful examples at bioarchitects.net where our partner Oldrich Hosman, Olda in Prague, is expert, and his examples of house layouts based on magnetic line dowsing are fabulous. Again, bioarchitects.net, Olda, and also the most advanced geobiology school in Europe, Stefan Cardinot, is also at goldenmean.info/architecture. There are many, many examples of using a magnetic map to assist with the layout of the house. But essentially, the principle is that successful compression enables life force. It actually enables life itself. And so you do essentially need to train yourself to be able to make a simple magnetic map. As they said, our famous friend Gary Skillen in Canada, he was famous. You don't tell him who is sick in your house. He goes in and makes a magnetic map of everybody's bed, and then he will tell you who's sick in the house. So your process here is you go make a magnetic map of your bed, your house, your yard, and your village, and then rearrange everyone to look like a rose, and you're done. But and that essentially means that, you know, when we went to Prague, yes, they attract money and tourists because the magnetic map of Prague is a rose, actually, and there are pictures there. And it's simple because it's originally a volcanic caldera, which made a magnetic map for the city that looked like a rose.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
And by the way, my clairaudience, Valerie wanted more conversations with her ancestors, and I'm a klutzy clairaudient. I can hear ancestors sometimes, but when we were in Prague, I was talking to her ancestors.
That's fabulous. Yeah, actually, we have a couple of students here that were my students last year, and they have reported to lucid dream together very
Nice.
frequently. And so I told them about you immediately. And
yes, exactly. Because we're working on that rather diligently, because we believe that the planet as a whole gets more immune system when we have lucid dream teams. This is called luciddreamteam.com, actually. And we have a lucid dream teaming Telegram group and a lucid dream team gatherings. Jenny Markey is the name of our wonderful shaman lady from Australia who's leading a lot of that work. The point being that when a group learns to lucid dream together, they can collectively make centripetal force, which has the power to ... steer tornadoes, repair geopathics, create a resistance to parasites for the Earth as a whole. The ability to lucid dream as a team is essential, and in fact carry Mother Nature's silver seed through the sun to a new heart in the sun. Well, that Mother Nature's silver seed is just like a beehive swarming. They will never swarm without the presence of royal blood, which is to say the presence of the navigator. The navigator is you as you learn how to lucid dream, because you have become centripetal, and you can therefore steer successively larger tornadoes. It's essential.
beauty. Well, I also have a lot of questions about, you know, Agnihotra and sort of the ability that we have through a ceremony like Agnihotra, or the creation of a beautiful harmonic temple or home, to actually affect the surrounding ecosystem or the surrounding town. Because I've heard a lot of stories from you and other people about, you know, this practice of Agnihotra, where, you know, you're burning the cow dung and the ghee at the precise moment of sunrise, saying a prayer, and it has a measurable effect on, I think, plant growth and animal growth within a certain radius, like a couple of acres. Is that right?
Yes. Agnihotra is a very useful example here, because you can see this pictures at fractalfield.com/fractalspacetime or fractalfield.com/online book. Pictures are there of Agnihotra. But the principle is that when they light that living plasma, which is the natural biologic ghee burning gently, and so you have a plasma cloud. Now that plasma cloud is placed in a copper pyramid implosive capacitor, and advanced Agnihotra, there's a larger giant pyramid underground below that. So it's highly implosive plasma. And now I remember when we did this, it's called the Homa Center in Poland. And this was a farm which was like a Garden of Eden paradise in an area which was desertified. I mean, the area was not fertile, but that farm, the few acres around that farm, was visibly an incredibly green paradise. And they had been intensively doing Agnihotra there for years. And the other famous story is that at Bhopal disaster and at Nagasaki, those who survived were often those who accurately practiced Agnihotra. The physics here is instructive, that sunrise and sunset, and you can feel your hair stand up just at that instant. I mean, they timed this with a computer. They got it precise when they lit that plasma, and you could feel that plasma wind converge, and my hair stood up. It was very cool. It was accurately the second of sunset there in Poland. It was amazing. So what the sunrise sunset do, as the natives would call the four directions, they create the right angles necessary for phase conjugation. So the ancestors called this the sacred four directions. In the physics of phase conjugation, this is called four-wave mixing. It means when the flux lines converge accurately in the tetracubic lattice structure, this is what enables the pine cones to accurately focus and kiss implode where they touch noses. And so indeed, there you create a bubble of fertility, a bubble of negentropy. And if this is done regularly, it's incredibly powerful. It's just an example. Another example is that, you know, our plasma therapy, therify.net, is negentropic, implosive, broad spectral phase conjugate, noble gas living plasma. We regularly have many of our Therify centers, there's in 25 countries, many of them do healing at a distance regularly. And we teach that the healing at a distance is not a mystery. We teach the physics, that it's more likely if the sender and receiver are on a magnetic line cross. It's more likely if it's done at sunrise or sunset, or even better, equinox solstice, where the four waves can mix accurately and that implosion phase conjugates. And what happens in the four-wave mixing where the implosion phase conjugates and the pine cones kiss noses is the convergence touches to the center of the pressure array lattice at the Planck threshold, where the longitudinal coherence is enabled, embedded, and coupled. And that touching into the longitudinal array, what you would call the source, is the wave mechanics of all action at a distance. So in physics, when they call action at a distance requires entanglement to an Einstein-Rosen bridge, what they should more accurately say is that entanglement perfected is the problem phase conjugation solves, namely perfected embedding, which also happens to be the definition of compassion. So that ability to enable that embedding entanglement, in physics, they know that that's what makes action at a distance. They don't know that it's phase conjugation, which they call entanglement, which embeds perfectly and conjugates and touches the hard points of the longitudinal array. And that is DNA radio. That's actually the physics of teleporting. For example, when Jean-Charles Moyen made those same exact brain waves that children make who see without their eyes, except he did much higher amplitudes, and he teleported repeatedly with witnesses documented, and his teleportations were caused by, or correlate to, and we measured his brainwaves, dramatic alpha to gamma cascades, golden ratio, and octave ladder structure. And that implosion connected him to that longitudinal array, which is the physics of all portal, all action at a distance. Because the reason that enables action at a distance, which is not unrelated to Agnihotra, is because when the implosion happens at the center of the pine cone, Planck, where the longitudinal connection is enabled, at that still point, it isn't that the velocity propagation nodes are infinite. It is more accurate that the velocity propagation nodes are infinite, namely, as Professor Raymond Chow measured, the harmonics faster than light are golden ratio multiples times the speed of light. And the number of golden ratio multiples faster than the speed of light that are propagating depends on the compression density, which is why the Stargate in trapezium at the center of Orion is the most powerful stargate in our galaxy. Now, this is advanced science, but you're getting the flavor that if you begin to understand how Agnihotra works, you can begin to think about some fun stuff.
It's really amazing. And, you know, we're just at the very beginning in applying all of this physics to, to our lives and really to the architecture, I think it's totally in its infancy at this time in history. But we can learn a lot from some of these ancient buildings as well. But yeah, I'm curious about other ways we can measure, because it's wonderful to dowse and to use our nervous system as a measurement, but it seems useful also, the Flame and Mind software and the antenna. It gives us some numerical data that I think lends a lot of credibility. So I think it's useful, and it can give us some feedback also about how our designs are working, for example. So I'm wondering about, gas discharge visualization. There's the BioWell, the Sputnik device. I haven't used it yet, but that does something similar. You can get some measurements with that. The gas discharge visualization, also you can see the bioenergy field. It's visualized. They have cameras. You can see it in real time. So with all these tools, and I'm sure there's many others, you can enlighten us, but I'm wondering how we can start to use those tools to eventually work on modeling certain building designs before they're built. Even maybe we can get data from buildings that are already built, and then kind of use that in reverse and say, well, this is what worked, well, let's repeat these shapes and these practices and so on. So if there can be eventually more of kind of a formulaic approach where we'd say, if we do X, Y, and Z, we will get a charge implosive high capacitance building. You think that's possible, or are we going too techie? Should we just,
Well, I think we improve our intuition by measurement, absolutely, and both are wonderful here. And you're right to mention BioWell. Professor Korotkov, who invented the GTV, the BioWell, we were good friends for many years, and indeed, we had a very detailed discussion on one occasion and agreed that our spectrum analysis of the capacitance of the weak electric field of sacred building is perfectly parallel to what he's measuring. What he's measuring is a passive capacitor, and which is basically a metal tree shape, and he measures the ability to propagate charge easily. So in other words, for example, if you take a titanium cylinder and place it on a fingertip Kirlian device, which is what GDV really is, and you happen to be in a corner of a metal building where your aura is horrible, you will notice that a spark trying to propagate from there has big trouble. There is no way out. You're stuck. Oops. And so when you measure the GDV of a horrible metal building, the capacitance that propagates, it's literally, when you take a gas discharge visualization, the Kirlian type photograph, is your finger is on the surface of a glass plate and there's a big spark underneath. That's all it is, really. And they just measure whether the spark has someplace to go. That's it. And if your finger happens to be brilliantly healthy and ecstatic, the spark around your fingertip can propagate beautifully and make gorgeous pictures. And then they know that you're healthy. They measure the size of the propagation and the fractality thereof. So the same is true of a sacred building versus an ugly metal building. If the spark has no place to go, charge distribution is not enabled, hint opposite of fractality. So the point is, the principle is exactly the same. In both cases, we're measuring charge distribution efficiently. Two slightly different ways. He developed some pretty cool mathematic algorithms for quantifying the fractality of the boundary conditions of the array of the Kirlian photograph. I mean, this was pretty cool mathematics they did there in Russia with our Professor Konstantin, our buddy there. But, it's true that our technique, which actually measures the specific harmonics thereof, enables more diagnostic kind of activity. But the principle is the same. So yes, all you're looking for is charge distribution efficiency, literally where auras can breathe. That is the principle. And you're right, multiple ways of measuring that are very useful. I might mention also at goldenmean.info/geobiology, our work with Stefan Cardino, where we were measuring magnetic lines. Now, there was a handheld detector you'll see there at goldenmean.info/geobiology, and you can measure a few nanoteslas. And if you're very still and very relaxed and there's no wind, you can almost measure an Earth grid magnetic line in nanoteslas, but it's a very sensitive measure. Now, there's some very big array devices that can do that nicely, but the handheld ones are a little too noise susceptible. But the point is, once you understand the measurement technology, you can measure Earth grid magnetic lines in nanoteslas, as you can also measure the frequency signature of Earth grid magnetic lines. And all of Stefan Cardino's work in that regard also are at goldenmean.info/geobiology, the 30, 50, 60, 80 hertz, which are the natural resonance frequencies of Hartmann, Pei-Wei, Curie, Palm, the Wiseman, the different energy lines of the Earth. We actually know the frequencies thereof. So this advanced science of geobiology is very deep. You can actually do the research, and it's a very deep and wonderful science. Point being, in terms of Scott's question, yes, at least to understand enough of the basics of this so you can begin to predict in advance which building is going to have a shot at that level of charge distribution efficiency. You know, the bigger picture of that building, the old feng shui principle of Ming Tang, you know, where the rivers cross and make a little womb-shaped energy bubble. There's a big picture here too.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Yeah, well, we're getting to a point where we could create, we could do the same design of a certain form, a certain geometry we know that is pretty effective, and we could put that same building in two different places on the Earth, two different locations, and then that way you're starting to isolate the variables, right? Then you can measure things, or you could, build a slightly different structure in the same location at different times and get different measurements. But what I found really fascinating is what you told me last year. You said that, we can't just build a scale model of a structure and get any kind of useful measurement of it, because why? It's not this final size, and so it doesn't capture the
it wouldn't be in ratio 2.
Yeah, it's not related to the wavelengths of all the frequencies surrounding it in the same way as the final version. So we really need to build the full size version and then measure it. And it seems like there's really no other way. I mean, apart from maybe a little down the road, we could have some, AI computer modeling or something like that. But just building the full size model, I think, is the way to go.
There's some wonderful precedent to this kind of work, which Juan Schlosser beautifully did there in Bali, goldenmean.info/architecture, and actually put together a book on that, where he showed that the bamboo structure versus the metal structures, measure the harmonics, measure the seed germination, correlated, and showed replicably that it was true that the biologic material caused a harmonic signature that replicably caused seed germination, measure the seed germination, measure the harmonic, and proved that difference between a biologic and a non-biologic building. So some of that work has been done. It's beautiful.
Definitely. Bradley.
So I live here in Arizona, and just thinking about how humans follow their beliefs rather than what is. So the last governor was following this ideology, which caused them to form this huge border with stacked freight containers, and then it also destroys the biodiversity that's like millions of years evolved, and those are like fractal complexes too. The cactus itself, and so I'm thinking about like ways to like transmute that energy. Like people have thought about like doing aeroponic gardens in those freight shipping containers, and then like encasing it in a structure that would start to transmute some of that energy, because you're dealing with metal. So I was just wondering your thoughts on that, like how we can take things like that and transmute and mitigate and transform.
Yeah, that is a bit of a hard one. You know, there are lots of people now that are doing pictures of, we made our house from a few shipping containers. Well, actually, from the point of view of my study of this, the steel that is a shipping container is by definition fatal to every kind of living capacitance. Sorry. I don't, people say, well, yeah, you could hang some hemp fiber and put some clay here and there. Maybe you could create a little island of capacitance somewhere. But in general, a steel shipping container is pretty much as much of a nightmare as you can get in terms of living architecture. So I can't think of a way offhand that a stack of steel shipping containers could transmute anything. Beyond me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had some clients of mine I was talking to last night actually, and they're doing an amazing project to do some refugee housing in Maui right now that I'm assisting with, and they really want to use these steel studs that they have because, you know, they're recycled steel. So it on the one hand, it's an available material and it is quite durable and it's very lightweight. But I told them, hey, it's not really fitting with my principles of what I know to be the best practices. And they asked, well, isn't there a way we can get around this and maybe do something to the steel studs to improve them, like maybe coat them with a copper paint or something like that? And I said, well, maybe. So that's my question.
Yeah,
Is there any?
it's true that a small amount of metal may be necessary in some places. And if it's well surrounded by a good biological material, one of the highest dielectrics happens to be hemp, actually. Hemp fibers have a fabulous dielectric. So maybe that could help a bit. I'm not sure. And I'm sure there are situations where you have to have a small amount of metal, and I can understand that. But in general, if you look at every sacred temple that ever existed, you know, there's a place called the Integratron in Arizona, since we're talking about it, that I knew the guy that was involved in it. And they went to a huge amount of trouble to build that Integratron without a single piece of metal. Yeah, and that was before my day. They figured something out. If you want the capacitor to implode, so actually, unfortunately, yes, but I do think you can build a bit of a sacred altar in your home, even if there's some metal in the walls, by, you know, creating some biological material and create a bit of a bubble. I do think that is possible, of course.
Can we talk a little bit about what Juan Schlosser is doing with mineralizing the wood, the bamboo materials? Because I know he's working with the technique where I think they're removing the sugars from the wood fiber cellulose, soaking it in a solution, and then soaking the wood in another solution that adds a lot of minerals to the cellulose, and so it's preserving it. It's basically like a, you know, like a mineralization, you know, and so this process could offer a lot of capacitance to a building because of the minerals embedded in the wood. And do you know anything about that process? Or?
Well, I heard a little, and it reminds me of a wonderful short story. So the day I first learned to make a living capacitor, uh, Professor Phil Callahan in Florida, tuning into nature, shows us how to measure whether a tree is going to live or die. And so he takes this little hemp fibers, you know, hemp cloth, a small amount, and he wraps it around an oscilloscope probe, and he's, you know, spectrum analyzing a microphone. And then he says, but there's one more thing you got to do. He says, you dip this into some living seawater and let it dry in the sun. Hint, trace mineral, hint, rhodium, iridium, hint, organic ormes. And then he said something which is even more interesting. He said, and if you don't have any living seawater handy, you can soak it with some living human sweat. That works great also. No sweat, man. And you have these images of the Aboriginal tribe initiating the new young teenage boys. And how do they do it? They wipe him down in the sweat of all the males. Doesn't that sound romantic? But actually, you see, there's a trace mineral. And then when that bakes in the sun, that is a fabulous biological capacitor. I mean, that's how the first living capacitive probes were made, was baking in the sun a little bit of the trace mineral of deep sea water or living human sweat, actually. So yes, that trace mineral correctly baked in can produce a radically gorgeous biologic capacitor, I'm sure, if you measure the dielectric constant. So that there'd be a lot of good reason for getting the right trace minerals buried, and the trace mineral recipe would be related to which deep seawater they make this sacred water with. What is it? Oh, the deep seawater they take to make agricultural ormes from, because it's high in rhodium, iridium, emulet. So the right trace mineral, and you bake that into the bamboo and the wood. Oh yeah, excellent capacitor.
Okay.
So is there a way to measure the capacitance of different materials without measuring the space? Like I use my flame in mind, but I want to know, is there another device? Can I touch it to the material and it'll tell me how conductive it is, or is there a way to measure that?
Well, electrical engineering 101 here. A digital capacitance meter is not expensive these days, and is measured in micro or nanofarad typically. Now, to measure the dielectric constant, all you do is you take a known area of metal plates, and you know the thickness, and you stick whatever material between the plates of the capacitor and measure the amount of capacitance you just made. And there's a formula, and out comes the dielectric constant, which is simply saying how efficient that capacitor was. So that is the theory. So the measurement of capacitance is measurable. And indirectly, the amplitude of the peaks at flame in mind is telling you how powerfully that capacitor is resonating. So when the amplitude of the peaks in your brainwaves are really strong, and the amplitude and the peaks of your measurement of a tree are really high, that means that's sufficient capacitance.
Any questions from someone we haven't heard from yet? Anybody else?
Well, it's not a, it's kind of question. Mr. Winter, first, you remind me Carlos Castañeda. I read that book like 33 decades ago. And second, I was in a place on Mexico, in Jalisco. I don't remember how they call, but it's an energy place. Like you can hear your own voice if you stand up in the center.
Good echo.
Yeah, yes. It was so weird. And I was in Elora caves as well. And they allow me, one of the guards, they allow me to enter a certain space that I was not public. And the echo was, and the energy was amazing.
That's right.
So it was kind of weird and strange, and yeah, so.
It's so cool that it's almost literally true. Immortality is the perfect echo. This definition of sacred space is the perfect echo. I mean, that is a physics metaphor you could take quite literally.
It is. But those spaces when you echo with your own voice, so you cannot hear that energy places, I think it's a few on Earth, right? A few.
Unfortunately, because we've messed up so many of those.
Yeah.
And we don't teach what sacred space is. We don't teach what having a soul is. And we don't teach what a perfect echo is electrically, which actually is this perfect resonance and perfect charge distribution. So it's urgent that we make this message shareable. Thank you. Thank you, dear.
Thank you.
So how are we doing? It's about 8:20 here. I think we had a pretty good recording. Are there any last questions or thoughts? Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
Anybody else want to go? All right. Well, so I was just gonna try to ask it a different way. Like I was thinking about, I've been a massage therapist or body worker integratively for 30 years, and thinking about how the liver's capacity to regenerate tissue, and what is it about, it takes all of this and then it organizes chaos and then even regenerates itself. Like, so how can structures do something similarly energetically, and also in a way that's just like you're becoming the ideology instead of just like wishing it.
There's a lot of ways to look at biology in this regard. Our Flame in Mind software, the Flame in Sound, has specific harmonics to trigger specific glands. There's quite a bit of literature on that, and even to trigger a specific chakra. So the liver would certainly fit into that matrix. And the other things to bear in mind there would be not just the frequency signature, but things like the alkalinity of the water. We're drinking this Kangen alkaline water, and it's so dramatic for helping flush the liver, for example. And things like livingplasmatherapy.net help the blood remove the toxins, and they're deposited in the liver, and that's good. But if you just had chemo and the plasma triggers the toxins into your liver too quickly, that's dangerous. So understanding and recognizing how detox works in the liver is very critical, obviously, and that experience of detox is directly related to where did the charge implode, because where the charge implodes is where the sorting has happened. So if your body has the opportunity to be in places of high charge, for example, take a swim in ice cold, fresh river water or something like that, your body gets a lot of implosive capacitance. Whereas if you're never grounded, you never did the book Earthing, then your liver is having a tougher time.
Oh, thank you so much. And by the way, I love your website, the therify.net, how you scroll down and there's that hedron, and I looked up who your designers were for your web design. That's really cool.
It's an imploding double helix. Yeah.
Yeah, it's neat.
Thank you. So how are we doing?
I wanted to make sure everybody was aware of the Therify device, because I didn't really explain before this, but so Dan and Paul Harris is his name, right?
Mm-hmm.
Came up with this device that produces a golden ratio cascade of frequencies. It sort of is mimicking, what you see in the earth and at the Great Pyramids, and it is a healing series of frequencies. And I've used the device more than a few times, and I absolutely love it. It induces bliss, and it's known to create spontaneous healing and lucid dreaming and
Kundalini sometimes.
Yes, Kundalini. It's sort of a sacred space in a box, like you can bring this thing and plug it in, and
we're not saying you need a gadget, but if you want to play with a gadget, here's an example. But the one thing to be noted, if you see the picture at therify.net and the How It Works page, those things they call the light bulbs in the Egypt stone carvings, they look like plasma tubes. That's actually what the Therify looks like. And so when the Egyptians, when the Anunnaki said, we're making a Shem unto the Lord, and that was mistranslated, an altar in the church, Sitchin translated that Shem to mean highward firestone, implosive capacitor. And the function was well articulated in the Anunnaki literature. It was because they were aging catastrophically. So when they built a Shem unto the Lord, if you transliterate the Sumerian, they were literally building their critically necessary age reversal electric field. So to build a Shem unto the Lord in Sumerian is quite literally, from an electrical engineering, we needed an age reversing electric field, because when they got here, they were aging catastrophically, and they said so. So if you would like to build a Shem unto the Lord, as you have been instructed in the Sumerian, I suggest you consider building an age-reversing electric field, which is the word Shem means access to a black hole, as in alchemy and schematic, and the original name for Egypt, the place of the blue-black blood. So access to a black hole is a definition of alchemy and chemistry, because it's access to charge collapse. So you see that when the Egyptians made a picture they call the Egyptian light bulb, which turns out to be a pretty accurate photograph of therify.net, they needed age reversal, and they said so. So suddenly the concept of time reversing and phase conjugation has a very ancient meaning. Thank you, Scott, for asking another one of the most
Yes,
fun
yes.
questions here.
Well, I mean, I love this conversation because we can touch on all these different topics, and they're all really so intimately tied together.
Yep.
And I really enjoy, looking forward into the near future. I mean, very near future. We have so many changes, positive changes coming, and part of it's due to our understanding of physics and reality and the technologies and better design. And so I'm wondering what you see, Dan, in terms of the next steps in housing and biological architecture design, and how we can and really push it forward and implement it, and really what are some of the new technologies that will be involved in the houses coming really soon. I mean, we could have a Therify in every house, and we could have we can have the ability to promote charge collapse, maybe even create free energy, maybe have gravity reversal, and things like that. So what's your vision of the near future for housing?
I've done many international lectures on the generalized principle of the origin of all vacuum energy devices. You can see those lectures, fractalfield.com/vacuum energy, including the International Amsterdam Conference there. And the principle behind all zero-point vacuum energy devices is specifically enabled charge collapse, for sure. There is no question. And that is exactly what we're discussing. When you get the momentum gathered in that implosive collapse towards center, that is the physics of the reason every single zero-point energy device worked. From the moment Schauberger's piezoelectrically rock powder doped water vortex spontaneously got colder and began making electricity from gravity, to why the plasma tubes of Therify sometimes spontaneously get colder, that is charge collapse, and that is zero-point energy, and that is the right question. We don't have time, obviously, for the electrical engineering now, but I'd like to make one more comment about Scott's question about the future. And this is just a humble suggestion. Remember when Castaneda said, you need to know where your place of power is? I'm going to suggest to you that your children, our children, need to know where their place of power is, actually. The place they could regularly go to be recharged, literally. Is it a stone circle out in the yard? Is it their favorite circle of trees? Is it their favorite magnetic line through the house? Is it their little altar with the crystals? Whatever it is, every child needs to know where they can be recharged, as do you. And that is an immediate question. So I threw the challenge back in our laps now.
Yeah. Reminds me of the little grove of the forest that I used to visit as a kid.
Yep.
4 years old, I'd walk down the road and just go hang out in the forest, and you can feel your hands buzzing. I would feel
Exactly.
my feet buzzing. Yeah.
And there's a place through this house where the magnetic line from Sacred Canigou Mountain goes through, and I know where where you can go to be recharged if you need any time, and the children need to be taught, which is similar to saying, that they cheered in the church in Italy when I said, the definition of culture is not the color of your shoe polish and wine. No, the definition of culture is, do you have the skill to teach your young people how to have a bliss experience? That defines culture, because that defines their immune system and their immortality. On that note.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much for being here.
We had some
I really
fun.
appreciate it.
I'm at
we
your
all appreciate you.
I love all the twinkling eyes here. Thank you. Nice to meet you all.
Such a pleasure and an honor. Yes.
Blessings.
Have a good night, Dan.
Let's stay in touch. Talk soon. Blessings.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Blessings.